Hey, this is the January-February topic analysis for policy negatives. And so I'll start by breaking it up into a couple of core generics. And so I think that kind of an important part of this argument is that, especially on this topic, picks are less viable because there's a very strong argument for actor specification and country specification. And so any smart half will have a country key warrant because there are only 8 or 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. And so this should be a major restricting argument when thinking about what types of negative strategies to cut for these debates, because there is this intuition that we should be cutting a lot of picks because picks in general are very smart, but there might not be as many places to apply them. And the kind of classes of picks that we want to look for are picks out of specific parts of specific countries instead of the India pick or the Israel pick. Another good argument is the generic impact turn. And so on this topic, it's very unlikely that there will be a banning nuclear weapons is good for prolif argument. And so there's quite a decent literature base that proliferation is good. Things like mutually assured destruction and deterrence. You could pair it with a defensive realism argument that says that proliferation allows for the development of regional security alliances and bubbles as opposed to global hegemon, things like that. The one problem you might get is a trend towards non-proliferation now, but I think that this is relatively resolved by things like Trump and Putin ripping up nuclear deals, or worst case scenario, you can always add a uniqueness counterplan to it. The next argument is a little bit weird, but it's like a reverse spending dissad. And so the argument here is something along the lines of the fact that a country's government is currently spending quite a bit of money doing things like maintaining nuclear research and development, building bases, hiring personnel, etc., all of which contribute to global GDP. However, the plan would end that and ultimately be harmful to the economy by ending the spending of money. Now, this could go bidirectionally too, by saying that the amount of money it would take to build sites, to dispose of nuclear waste, to decommission nuclear weapons, etc., would cause a lot of money to be spent and unnecessarily push the economy into an inflationary bubble. This might not be the best generic, but it is something that may apply to every country, and so it's something that we should think about as a general strategy. Yes. And so kind of the next argument are types of generic instability disides. And so these disides are just arguments like Pakistan is stable right now. The plan causes political infighting, especially among nationalists. That throws the country over the brink. I think Pakistan is a good country where this instability dissad works. Other countries could be China, where Xi has promised to end the 100 years of humiliation. Suddenly ending nuclear weapons might not be the best look for him. The next argument that is a core generic is just a no first use counterplan. This would look something like we keep all of the nuclear weapons, but we all say we won't be the first to use them. There was a college policy topic that had some overlap with this area of research, and so there's kind of a lot of literature that can serve as good starting points for research into our specific topic regarding this counterplan. And so it's a good core generic. It also solves a lot of the deterrence/nuclear war arguments because there's a lot of good evidence that says that if every country adopts an NFU policy, it's very unlikely that miscalculation or kind of general tensions can lead to nuclear war. The next argument is some type of terror dissad with the argument eliminate. That would be that elimination doesn't actually require the complete kind of destruction of nuclear material, but that rather throughout the process of decommissioning, a lot of nuclear material can become desecuritized, which opens the door for terrorists to steal it and leads to things like dirty bombs. There's a lot of good evidence about terror arguments, and so it's a good dissad to read, especially with regards to AFs like the Iran AF or the Israel AF or the China AF. The next argument is we'll focus on each of the countries individually, discuss some of the possible AFs surrounding those. And so the first one is the United States. It's a very good place of top area of the topic. The politics dissad, specifically impeachment in 2020, are both good ones. A kind of good the impeachment argument is a little bit more volatile right now, especially because the literature on it is very homogenous on Trump will not be impeached by the Senate, but will be impeached by the House. There may be kind of political repercussions, e.g. what impeachment does to political capital or things like USMACA, so it might become a good internal link, but the stronger argument is probably 2020. And so the link here would be something along the lines that Trump suddenly decommissioning every nuclear weapon ever causes major Republican backlash, just like how his withdrawal from kind of the Kurds cause that type of Republican backlash, and so it would kind of force moderates to stand down in 2020. And this could also be seen as an impeachment link, but the literature doesn't exist or is too definitively one side for a lot of 2N spin to occur. And then there's a lot of good Trump 2.0 arguments and why that turns case, especially a lot of the stability arguments regarding countries like Russia, because Russian war with NATO can still occur without nuclear weapons if they think that the U.S. is weaker and we lose our deterrence. The ICJ and consult counterplans are good ones on this, and so if the U.S. were to get rid of nuclear weapons, it could probably ask the ICJ. This counterplan would look something like drawing whatever the clause on the NPT, but also just say that drawing that clause where we don't do nuclear weapons, appeal to the ICJ. A lot of the same net benefits on the November-December topic, where the net benefit would not necessarily be avoiding politics because it requires United States action, but more so a question about ICJ legitimacy and whether that can resolve problems. There's an implicit counterplan solves case even if it doesn't solve case argument here with stability arguments, because a renewed ICJ is able to strengthen international credibility writ large, which would allow for kind of blanket effects to roll over and dissolve tensions in other parts of the country. Consult counterplans are another good one. There's a lot of literature about the U.S. nuclear umbrella being the only thing that keeps Japan and Korea from developing nuclear weapons, which builds into turns case argument to these deterrence decides. And so asking them before we do it could be a good idea. And there's actually, I think, a decent amount of literature that says that Japan currently wants U.S. kind of military presence off of their land, specifically places like the Okinawa base. This kind of devolves very naturally into the assurances disad. NATO also works with these. In general, we want to pair consult counterplans with assurances disads because asking them and getting their explicit permission will resolve a lot of the kind of information asymmetry / unpredictability arguments that are the root of wars with assurance disads. And so these can have impacts like Japanese proliferation, the decline of the United States hegemony, etc. Now, the last argument is one of my favorite ones because I think it resolves any type of politics disad that tries to go through Congress. The only problem is the disads that are going through Congress are not the best. The Congress devolution counterplan would really just be devolving nuclear authority to Congress. Right now, Trump can do whatever he wants with nuclear weapons. If he's in a bad mood, he could theoretically nuke Iran. And so the counterplan would simply change the Constitution or change the War Powers Act so that Trump no longer has any power over our nuclear weapon system, and it takes congressional approval before we can fire them. Now, this most likely solves the AF, but it probably doesn't solve a lot of topic-specific disads because giving Congress authority means that there's a lot of inertia before we fire nuclear weapons, which could hurt things like deterrence. The final argument is this UN kind of legitimacy disad, and so this is built around kind of like this Trump flip-flop argument where it's like Trump had pulled out of certain agreements, but now is trying to devolve, and it flips the stance of the United States. And this has a couple of impacts. The first one is the generic hedge argument, where allies no longer know what we're thinking. We say we're going to build nuclear weapons, and they were not going to develop nuclear weapons, and that increased unpredictability forces securitization because they don't know what will happen in the future. The second, perhaps, is just that the argument further weakens UN credibility because the United Nations has tried to get kind of the U.S. to rejoin certain treaties, but the U.S. deciding to get rid of nuclear weapons bypasses those links and makes the UN look worse as an international actor. The next class of countries, and I've combined them because there might not be the most ground on these topics, are the UK and France as. And so the NATO and Russia expansion disads are probably the two best disads. If the UK and France were kind of the cornerstones of World War II when NATO was formed to head back against the war, and they're very close to Russia. And so denuclearization by either of these countries, or possibly both, could be very bad in terms of sending signals to Eastern European allies who have joined NATO, for example, or are in the process of joining NATO, like the Ukraine, when saying that we won't have nuclear weapons, but Russia does. It could also become a Russian appeasement argument that would force kind of entrenchment in the area and possibly lead to things like World War III through reignition of the Balkans. There's also a good kind of Brexit politics disad, an argument being that kind of the plan or debates over whether or not the UK should denuclearize shift questions about Brexit down the gutter, and that kind of creates more Brexit fatigue, which allows for some weird stuff to happen with Boris Johnson behind the scenes, or it triggers no deal, which would obviously incite some of the stability modules. There's a lot of kind of game theoretic predictions right now in terms of what happens. If you think about doing research into these types of British politics decides, it would be best to wait until maybe after CPS. Because UK elections are in a few days, and those will determine how Brexit talks go for the better part of the next few years. And a lot of literature about what could disrupt Brexit will come out within the few days after the election. France has similar stability arguments where there's a lot of resentment in terms of France being seen as a lesser power over the past few years. And denuclearization would mean that France gives up one of its last kind of remaining harbingers of an older era where it used to be a global superpower. And that could kind of further engender a lot of the protests that are already happening against Macron because he's seen as internationalist, elitist, not standing up as much to Trump, things like that. There were the Yellow Jacket protests in France recently about gas prices, so there's a lot of general anti-Macron sentiment right now, and kind of being seen as anti-France or willingly giving up nuclear weapons could further worsen those and lead to political instability in the country, worsen terrorist attacks, cause maybe other political parties to get into power. I think that weak negs in this area, so there are only really a few dissents, are really compensated by some weaker asks in this topic region because there aren't a lot of convincing reasons for why the UK or France should denuclearize. Neither of them have very large nuclear arsenals, there's not a large risk of miscalculation, etc. So it's not too large of a problem. The kind of China-Russia apps I put together, even though they seem relatively different, because they have very similar political systems. And so US hedge bad disads are a very good core of this disad. China and Russia denuclearizing would be amazing for the United States because it allows for America to reassert hegemony. China no longer has the power to be able to do things like challenge the US in the South China Sea. NATO is strengthened now because Russia loses its entire nuclear arsenal. And so some argument that says that the expansion of US hegemony is bad because kind of only two possible challengers to the US giving up their nuclear weapons would allow for complete and unchallenged US primacy is a good argument, especially coupled with some of the kind of defensive realism opaque proliferation arguments, where in other countries who weren't secretly developing nuclear weapons, or who had an implicit understanding that countries like China would protect them, for example, North Korea, would then start proliferating more and could even steal some of the nuclear material that's being decommissioned from China. The kind of Chinese argument is obviously a Xi nationalism CCP collapse decide. Xi is already struggling over a slowing economy right now, but he's most likely able to hold because of pro-China nationalist sentiment, which is why he's been flirting with the idea of sending troops into Hong Kong. There's been a lot of kind of resurgence of Taiwanese unification talk lately, things like that. And that's because he needs this focus on nationalism and this idea that he alone is the one who can bring China back as a number one country after 100 years of humiliation. If he suddenly gives up all of his nuclear weapons willingly, the Chinese people see this as kind of him giving up this commitment to make China number one again. And that results in kind of a lot of infighting in the CCP and a lot of general protests, which can cause the collapse of the state as a whole. Now, there are a lot of impacts associated with this, but perhaps one that could turn case is that through the process of collapse, it's likely that the nuclear material inside China would be lost before it could be fully decommissioned, which would open the doors to third-party groups seizing control or previously unarmed nuclear states getting access to nuclear material, especially in bordering countries like Azerbaijan or Armenia, which could actually increase the number of nuclear armed states and not decrease them. Another good one is Obor politics, where she kind of needs not political capital at home, but political capital abroad to be able to secure agreements, get countries together to build the One Belt, One Road initiative, which could be not good for the economy. And so you have an economic growth impact here, and there's a lot of arguments that go both ways. E.g., getting rid of nuclear weapons decreases political capital with countries in China's security umbrella like Mongolia, or increases it with international actors like Russia or the UK that need to be on board for it to be a geopolitical success in the long run. With Russia, there's a kind of Putin discontent or politics decide here that works very similarly as the Chinese discontent argument, also because Russia's economy has recently been slowing, and kind of there's a lot of kind of discontent with Russia writ large, but that Putin is able to hold them together with the nationalism that he would give up if he disarmed. There's a very similar kind of wag the dog argument here, where if Putin is forced to suddenly one day wake up and all the nuclear weapons are gone, he's not sure what happens, and so the only way for him to regain that nationalism that was in the kind of previous decide is by wagging the dog with Crimea and ordering a military invasion of it, which could then lead to things like NATO drawing and lead to global war. One place to think about, and lead to global war. The kind of last class of apps are the Israel, Iran, North Korea apps. These are the smaller states, the states that might not have as many geopolitical implications. And so Israel, there's this destruction decide. It does, which is kind of nuclear weapons, and this kind of nuclear ambiguity argument is the only thing that's been keeping Iran from invading Israel. The two have historically been kind of giant enemies. One is officially a Muslim state, the other is a kind of Jewish state, and there's a lot of historical tension, and I believe they've already fought around 2 wars around here. And so there's kind of this argument you could make that the only reason Iran hasn't invaded Israel yet is because there's this perception of a U.S. nuclear umbrella. The U.S. gave Israel nukes. If Israel were to suddenly give up nukes, it could send a signal to kind of the Iranian leadership, who are already at, like, where tensions with the U.S. and the West in general have already been high, to invade Israel. And that could cause things like an Iranian invasion that could trigger a global war. There's also kind of on either side of a country a very similar flip argument, where kind of getting rid of nuclear weapons in one or both or either gets rid of a kind of a stasis for deterrence, which would catalyze conventional war, which would destabilize the region once again, engender terrorism, etc. There's an Iranian politics decide, I think, where kind of there's a band of moderates led by the current Prime Minister Rouhani, which is trying to head back against advances made by kind of more conservative nationalists, led by kind of the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei, I think it is right now. And so this kind of perception of voluntary capitulation by the government to denuclearize after even though the West hasn't lifted sanctions on it yet, could be seen as capitulation, could be evidence that the kind of reform parties are weak and sweep the Conservative Party back into power, which would be very bad for a lot of kind of human rights reasons, but could also cause a more war-hawked focused Iran that is less likely to negotiate with the United States and more likely to do things like invade and destabilize other countries. There are also a lot of dirty bomb nuclear terror arguments which work very similar to core generics discussed earlier. And then especially in places like Iran and kind of Israel, there are a lot of arguments that say that these are kind of the two countries that are anchored in the Middle East, and they're very large regional superpowers. And so getting rid of any one of them would create a regional new kind of power vacuum, which would be bad because it allows for things like ISIS to take over in regions where influence had once been very consolidated but is now less consolidated. In regards to North Korea, there's kind of a Chinese assurances to that, specifically with reunification against affirmatives, where kind of the argument is that North Korea getting rid of nuclear weapons is the catalyst to unifying North and South Korea. This could possibly anger China because it would allow for kind of a Western-controlled satellite country like South Korea to be at the border of the Chinese government and be seen as a direct threat by the United States against North Korea. There's also an interesting U.S. politics decide, or I think a link to the 2020 decide here, where voluntary North Korean denuclearization can be spun as Trump has a foreign policy win, which can change especially the narrative around foreign policy, which is right now focused on illegitimate activities with Ukraine, which swing moderate voters, but kind of a redirecting of that narrative kind of is able to cause voters to forget about Ukraine. Trump can spin himself as great on foreign policy. He was obviously not corrupt because he got North Korea to denuclearize. He's super strategic. Everything he did was for a reason, etc., and reframe the narrative around something that allows him to ultimately win. I think there is a kind of slight problem here in terms of the affirmatives, which I think can make the negatives a little bit, which makes it easier for negatives because they won't have to deal with it as much as a literature issue, because there's very little literature about what would happen if Kim Jong-un suddenly voluntarily gave up his nukes, because it's not something that would really ever be done in life. And so there aren't many scholars who have wasted their time talking about it, so it's unlikely that this will become too viable of an affirmative strategy. That is it in terms of this topic analysis on negative ground. As usual, if you have any specific questions or you're looking for cards for any of these arguments, you can feel free to Slack me. Good luck researching and learning about this topic.